Chapter 18 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography by Walter Geer. Recording is in the public domain. 1812, Moscow. But little space can be given to the military and political events of the 2 years preceding the Russian war. After the Wagram campaign, Napoleon would have done well to return to Spain, but he remained at Paris, where he could better supervise the continental system, and devote himself to Marie Louise and a round of fêtes and provincial visits. In the meantime the Peninsular War dragged out its weary length. Soult and later Massena were put in command there with abundant reinforcements. King Joseph thought that the pacification of the country would be brought about more speedily by the occupation of Andalusia, while Napoleon's opinion was that the English should be attacked at Lisbon and driven out of Portugal when the insurrection in Spain would end for lack of support. Unfortunately he allowed himself to be over-persuaded by his brother. In 1810 Soult conquered and occupied Andalusia, but the 60,000 men employed there could have been used to better advantage elsewhere. Thus it happened that the whole task of driving out Wellington fell on Massena. For his descent into Portugal in May 1810, Massena had about 75,000 men, including the corps of Ney, Junot, and Régnier. Wellington fell back behind the celebrated lines of Torres Vedras, which he had been preparing for months before. These lines were constructed on the heights north of Lisbon, about 20 miles from the capital, where the 4 main roads from the north and east converged. They were practically impregnable against any force Massena could bring against them. After spending 5 months before these works, Massena was obliged to retreat just as Soult was finally coming to his assistance. So the whole operation against Lisbon failed through lack of cooperation and unity of leadership. This would never have happened if Napoleon had gone to Spain. Massena, followed by Wellington, retired to Salamanca, where he put his troops into quarters. In June, 1811, Marmont took over the command from Massena with orders to join Soult and renew the attack on Lisbon. Nothing definite, however, was accomplished. Early in 1812, before entering on the Russian campaign, Napoleon decided to withdraw 60,000 seasoned troops from Spain, and to content himself with the occupation of the provinces north of the Ebro, which had been annexed to the Empire. This wise plan was opposed by Joseph and the marshals in Spain, and once more, most unfortunately for him, the Emperor allowed himself to be won over by their arguments. He left nearly 300,000 men in Spain; under the command of Joseph in and around Madrid, of Soult in Andalusia, of Marmont near Salamanca, and of Suchet in Valencia. At this time Wellington had an army of about 140,000 English, Portuguese, and Spanish troops, and there were over 100,000 more Spaniards acting independently. At the end of 1810 England seemed on the verge of ruin from the strangling grip of the continental system. The 3% consuls had fallen to 25, and the bankruptcies averaged 250 a month. But this year was to see the climax of this great commercial experiment. In July, 1810, Louis was practically forced to abdicate as King of Holland. He had taken into his head the strange notion that he reigned by divine right, and refused to carry out the orders of his brother. When 20,000 French troops were approaching Amsterdam to bring him to reason, he suddenly abandoned his throne and fled to Bohemia. On the 9th of July, Holland was annexed to the Empire, and the commercial decrees were executed as rigorously at Rotterdam as at Havre. At the close of the year the commercial system was extended to the Baltic by the annexation of Oldenburg, the northern parts of Hanover and Westphalia, and Bremen, Hamburg, and Lubeck. Nothing less than the most rigorous enforcement of the continental system could suffice Napoleon; for it was a characteristic feature of this enterprise that its entire success depended on the completeness with which it was put into execution. One gap would render useless the whole barrier so laboriously constructed. Nevertheless, English goods by many devious routes still reached the continent, and in one way or another, with infinite discomfort and friction, trade was still carried on. It is strange that Napoleon never thought of cutting off the export of foodstuffs to England. He apparently had the notion that the more the British bought, the sooner they would go bankrupt. As Rose states, The outlook would have been hopeless had not our great enemy allowed us to import continental corn, if, besides lack of work and low wages, there had been the added horrors of a bread famine. In the main the continental system was popular in France, and the people endured the high prices, and the lack of English goods and of staples like sugar, coffee, rice and tobacco carried in British ships. At this time the Emperor was delighted at the noteworthy discovery that sugar could be extracted from beetroot. Pride in the national glory and hatred of England led the French to endure without complaint increased taxes, high prices, and even chicory. For Germany the hardships were far greater, and the benefits far less, and the unpopularity of the continental system was one of the principal underlying causes of the national uprising in 1813. Upon Russia also the influence of the system was more and more oppressive. Napoleon's complaints of the Russian laxity of administration were constant. Another cause of friction was the annexation of Oldenburg. The heir to this duchy had married Alexander's elder sister, Catherine, for whose hand Napoleon had negotiated at Erfurt. The deposition of the Duke was not only a personal affront, it was a violation of the Treaty of Tilsit. But even before the news of this event reached Russia, the Czar himself broke the treaty. Instead of admitting on easy terms, as arranged at Tilsit, the articles de luxe of French manufacture, he levied a heavy duty on them. When called to account by Napoleon, Alexander pleaded the economic needs of his country, and protested his fidelity to the continental system, while at the same time calling attention to the Oldenburg grievance. But Napoleon would not listen. "Here is a great planet taking a wrong direction," he exclaimed. "I do not understand its course at all." To bring this planet back into its orbit, 500,000 men were to perish amidst the snows of Russia, and Napoleon was to die in exile at Saint Helena. Although there were many subsidiary reasons for the breach with the Czar, the real cause of the war was Napoleon's determination to force Russia to accept the conditions of the continental blockade, in order to destroy England's trade and commerce. It was not his ambition for absolute sovereignty in Europe which carried him to Moscow, but the undying vendetta. For 2 years it had been evident that a break with Russia must come sooner or later, and Napoleon had been steadily preparing himself during this time. He secured the alliance of Austria, and compelled Prussia to furnish him troops and supplies. The Czar also foresaw the war, and made preparations for it. The Russians, however, had no formal plan, but merely proposed to act on the defensive. They were in doubt as to whether they should meet the attack by advancing to the Vistula, or await it behind their own frontiers. The strategy which they afterwards employed so successfully was the result of circumstances rather than any preconceived plan. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, the Russian army had been entirely reorganized, and under the new plan should have produced in 1812 an active army of 500,000 men, with double that number in reserve. But when the army was mobilized on the frontier in the spring of that year, it was found that there were less than 250,000 men. Napoleon moved his grand army to the line of the Vistula during the months of February, March, and April. This field army consisted of 31 infantry and 27 cavalry divisions, and numbered 450,000 men, including 50,000 cavalry and 1,000 guns. This force was organized in 9 corps d'armée, under the command of Davout, Oudinot, Ney, Eugène, Poniatowski, Gouvion Saint-Cyr, Régnier, Vandamme, and MacDonald. An additional corps of 33,000 men under Victor came up later, and an 11th Corps of 47,000 was in reserve at Berlin and Mayence, under the command of Augereau. Transportation was organized on the largest scale. Every possible source had been drawn on for supplies. Nothing was neglected. One thing only Napoleon had apparently forgotten since his campaign in Poland: the fact that there were no roads worthy of the name in Russia. There were too many wagons and far too many servants. There were also many women, the love escort, which was tolerated in the armies of the Republic and the Empire. At the very outset it seemed as if the expedition would be destroyed by its impedimenta. Still, if Napoleon had been able to bring on a battle near the frontier, or had adhered to his original plan not to go beyond Smolensk the first year, all might have gone well. More than half of the cavalry were French, and nearly all of the artillery, but less than half of the infantry arm. In this enormous number of foreigners there were Italians, Germans, and Poles, and even battalions of Swiss, Spanish, Portuguese, and Croats. The Prussian and Austrian contingents operated by themselves on either wing. The French element was large enough to leaven the batch, and the failure of the campaign cannot be laid to the indiscipline of the common soldiers, although some of the marshals and division commanders who were weary of war failed to do their full duty. The Emperor was accompanied by a host of executives, including Berthier, chief of staff; Lebrun, Mouton, and Rappe, aide de camp; Daru, secretary of state; Maret, minister of foreign affairs; Caulaincourt and Duroc; Meneval and Fin, private secretaries; and Jomini, historiographer. Berthier, as usual, was the efficient mouthpiece of the Emperor. Jérôme and Eugène were in command because of their relationship, but the latter was an able leader. Davout and Ney had proved their worth in previous campaigns. Bessières, Oudinot, Saint Cyr, Victor, and Junot were good corps commanders. Soult, Marmont, and Suchet were still in Spain, and Masséna had retired in broken health after his failure there. Lefebvre commanded the Old Guard, of nearly 50,000 men in all, while Murat was at the head of the large cavalry reserve of 40,000 horsemen. On the 9th of May, Napoleon, accompanied by Marie Louise and a large part of his court, left St. Cloud for Dresden, where he arrived a week later. Here he expected to make a stay of 2 or 3 weeks, before putting himself at the head of his troops, and to receive the visits of the allied sovereigns. The first morning the princes who had already arrived called to present their homage to the Emperor, who was lodged in the state apartments of the royal palace. The second day the Emperor and the Empress of Austria arrived, to the great joy of Marie Louise, who had not seen her father since her marriage 2 years before. The sojourn at Dresden was the apogee of the power of Napoleon. No mortal had ever before reached such a pinnacle of glory as the new Charlemagne. The assembled sovereigns appeared to be the courtiers rather than the equals of the Emperor. His lever, says Ségur, furnished a remarkable spectacle where sovereigns came to attend the audience of the conqueror of Europe. At Saint Helena the Emperor, in recalling the memories of these past splendors, said, "The Dresden meeting was the epoch of the greatest power of Napoleon. There he seemed to be the king of kings." He had summoned from Paris the company of the Théâtre Français, and, as at Erfurt, Talma played before a parterre de rois. But Napoleon was far from being entirely taken up with pleasure while at Dresden. He was occupied with the many minute details of the immense expedition which he was about to undertake. Just before Napoleon left Dresden, the King of Prussia arrived. He had agreed to furnish for the coming campaign 20,000 men under the command of a Prussian general. As for Austria, she had promised a contingent of 30,000 troops, commanded by an Austrian general, under the orders of Napoleon. The 29th of May, 1812, Napoleon left Dresden to place himself at the head of his army. After a stop of 2 days at Posen, he proceeded to Thorn, and from there to Danzig. By long marches the troops had reached the Vistula, where they were spread out on a front of 400 miles. This plan had been adopted by the Emperor with the design of keeping the Russians uncertain as to his main line of advance, and resulted as he wished in their separating their armies. The numbers of the Russian armies are hard to determine, but they probably amounted to less than 250,000 men. With these forces they were to meet 500,000 invaders under the greatest captain of modern times. The statement has often been made that the Russians expected to meet the French advance by a constant retreat, and that Alexander had said that before yielding he would abandon Moscow and retire into Siberia. But the fact remains that the Russian generals expected to fight, and that the defensive campaign was the result of the Russian unpreparedness at the beginning, and the overwhelming superiority of the French forces. Thus it happened that the very size of Napoleon's army was to be the principal reason for his failure. It was physically impossible to keep such an enormous host supplied, and the great discrepancy in numbers made the Russians afraid to risk a battle. "From a military point of view," says Dodge, "the retiring scheme of the Russians against a stronger and more able foe was the best. But the Czar had to look at some political questions. If a system of retreat was adopted, the Polish provinces would fall away from their allegiance, and the opposition of the anti war party might be grave, as well as the effect upon friendly nations. There were but 3 roads leading across the Russian frontier by which the main part of the Grand Army could advance: at Kovno and Grodno on the Niemen, and further south and west at Brest-Litovsk on the Bug. During the winter the Russian troops had been spread out over a front of 500 miles, but in May, when the French approached the Vistula, the troops drew together into 2 large bodies under Barclay and Bagration, with headquarters at Vilna and Lutsk. These 2 armies were separated by the morasses of the upper Pripet, and their distance from each other was due to the broad front of Napoleon's advance. As soon as it became apparent that Napoleon was marching on the Niemen, the Czar withdrew his troops from Bagration, and strengthened Barclay's army at Vilna to 130,000 men, while Bagration with 50,000 troops came up to Volkovysk, south of Grodno. The 2 Russian armies thus stood across the 3 roads to Moscow. Napoleon does not seem to have had any particular plan of campaign, beyond the general idea of finding the Russian army, and, as at Austerlitz, winning "not an ordinary victory." Metternich states in his Memoirs that the Emperor told him at Dresden that in his first campaign he did not expect to go beyond Smolensk. In the Russian camp there were as many plans of campaign as there were leaders. Barclay favored awaiting the French on Russian soil, and then fighting. Bagration wanted to hold the line of the Niemen, and at the same time invade the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The Czar proposed a policy of retreat. Having learned in a general way of the location of the 2 Russian armies, Napoleon's first plan was to break in between Barclay and Bagration, by an advance on Vilna through Kovno. The Grand Army began its movement from the Vistula on the 6th of June, and reached the Niemen 18 days later. Napoleon immediately crossed the river without meeting with any resistance. He then advanced rapidly to Vilna, covering the distance of 60 miles in 4 days. He was disappointed, however, in taking the first army by surprise, as they retreated rapidly on his approach. The roads were almost impassable, and guns and wagons were continually embedded in the mud. After waiting 3 days to obtain information about the enemy's movements, on the 1st of July Napoleon decided to advance due east. In the meantime, the 2 Russian armies had continued their retreat toward Smolensk, where they effected a junction on the 3rd of August. Both sides had lost about 1/3 of their numbers in the first 5 weeks of the campaign, the French from disease, and the Russians from wholesale desertion. The French troops had advanced so rapidly that the supply trains, floundering in muddy roads, could not keep pace with them. The men consequently lived to a large extent on meat, which they found everywhere, and fresh cut corn, which they either baked roughly or boiled in water. In a short time there was an epidemic of enteric diseases. At the end of July, the Emperor was compelled to call a halt for 8 days on account of the exhaustion of his troops, and to allow the supply trains to come up. After the 2 Russian armies had met at Smolensk, Barclay found himself compelled by the growing discontent among his troops to offer battle. So on the 7th of August he moved west towards the French. After a 2 days' march he came upon the enemy's outposts, but here his courage failed him at the thought of attacking Napoleon in person, and he came to a halt. On learning of this movement, Napoleon decided to march south to the Dnieper, cross the river, and advance by the south bank to a surprise attack upon Smolensk, and so force Barclay to give battle. This plan was carried out so effectively that the Russians remained in entire ignorance of the movement. On the 17th of August Napoleon appeared before the city, which 2 Russian corps hastily occupied, and to which Barclay fell back with all possible speed. On the following evening Napoleon moved forward to the attack, and bombarded the town. Barclay found it impossible to hold the place, so he evacuated it during the night, and retreated to the north bank of the river. This left the road to Moscow open, but in spite of the vigorous pressure of the French, he managed to get back onto the road the following evening, and secure his line of retreat eastward. The city of Smolensk lies on the south bank of the Dnieper, in a beautiful amphitheater of hills, with the suburb of St. Petersburg on the opposite bank. The place is difficult of defense, as it is commanded by the surrounding heights. The city proper was fortified with a brick wall 10 feet thick and 20 feet high, with a useless dry ditch. The walls would easily resist the field guns of that period, and could hardly be escaladed. It was an old sacred city, with numerous churches and convents and many gardens. The houses in the suburbs were nearly all of wood. It was one of the oldest cities in Russia, and had at one time contained 80,000 inhabitants, but had dwindled to not more than a quarter of that number. The river was crossed by a wooden bridge, and from the north bank ran the main roads to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Assuming the Emperor's design to have been the capture of Smolensk, his maneuver had been well conducted. But this was only an incident. The real object was to seize the Moscow road, cut off the Russian army, and compel it to fight at a disadvantage. This he failed to accomplish. By extending his right across the river and establishing a corps suitably supported upon the Moscow road, says Dodge, the longed-for battle could be forced, or the enemy thrown back on the St. Petersburg road eccentrically to his true line of retreat. For 3 days the strategically worthless town had arrested the Grand Army when time was of the essence. Smolensk was the natural terminus of the campaign of 1812, where Napoleon had first intended to stop, and where he should have stopped and put his army into quarters. As he was draining the supplies from a large part of the empire, the Russians would sooner or later have been compelled to advance and attack him. If for political reasons he was unwilling to retreat, this was the only sound military course open to him. His situation was not dissimilar to that in Poland during the winter of 1807, before Friedland. Although he could probably reach Moscow, there was no certainty that he could bring on a decisive battle there and dictate peace to the Czar. Even if he reached Moscow, he must have known that he could not maintain himself there with a line of communications over 500 miles long. Of the large force with which he crossed the Niemen, he had less than half left. At Smolensk, from the military point of view, there was still hope. At Moscow there was none. The situation is well summarized by Dodge as follows: If Napoleon stopped at Smolensk, he ran a certain risk of political damage. If he advanced to Moscow, all military chances were against him. But with an army at Smolensk, he could personally return to France, organize a fresh campaign, and in 1813 be better equipped for an advance, for he would have time to prepare a proper transportation. This plan offered him a show of success, political and military. The advance on Moscow now could succeed only if Alexander could be intimidated by a show of military power Napoleon no longer possessed. Yet Jomini and Clausewitz both approved Napoleon's decision as his only proper course. It is difficult to agree with these eminent authorities. Napoleon still had about 150,000 men actually in hand when he left Smolensk. He followed closely upon the heels of the retreating Russians, who had now been reinforced to 120,000 men. The Czar, who was disappointed with Barclay's Fabian tactics, which were ultimately to bring him success, now appointed Kutuzov to succeed him, with instructions to accept the battle for which everyone was longing. Kutuzov will be remembered in connection with the Austerlitz campaign. He was now 70, too portly to ride, and very inactive. A few days later, when the army reached Borodino, it was decided to take up a position there to cover Moscow. There were 2 post roads from Smolensk to Moscow, an old one and a new one, which were here about 2½ miles apart. The village of Borodino lay on the new road where it crossed the Kolotsa, an affluent of the Moskva. Here Kutuzov drew up his troops on a frontage of over 5 miles at right angles to the 2 roads. The country is rolling, but quite flat. The numerous brooks run through deep ravines. There were many woods, some of which had been cut. The Kolotsa runs for several miles parallel to the new road until near Borodino it crosses and leaves it to flow northerly towards the Moskva. The river is fordable in places. East of the village the land rises into a plateau a mile wide. Some simple field works had been erected by the Russians. The position was liable to be turned, but it was also one easy to defend. Between the 2 roads there are a number of hamlets and villages, the principal one being Simonovsky. Napoleon, after a short halt to give his men a rest, continued his advance in 3 columns. On the 5th of September, the leading troops of his right and center columns came in contact with the Russian left wing and forced it back. The following day Napoleon advanced to the attack. His left wing under Eugene kept close to the new road and was massed against Borodino. The center column moved towards Simonovsky, and further south the right wing under Poniatowski advanced along the old road. The whole frontage was about 3 miles and a half. In the battle of Borodino, fought on the 7th of September, the French numbered 130,000 against 120,000 Russians. Napoleon's plan was quickly formed after a reconnaissance of the enemy's position. On the left Eugene was to contain Kutuzov's right. Davout and Ney in the center were to break down his left wing, while Poniatowski on the right should turn his left flank. The object was to throw the Russians back on the Moskva, where he could fight them to a finish. The French showed the utmost courage, and the Russian defense was very stubborn. The losses on both sides were enormous. It was certainly a French victory, as Kutuzov in the end drew off his army in broken condition and retreated towards Moscow, 60 miles away. It enabled Napoleon to reach the sacred city, but his losses were so great that he could not remain there unless the Czar treated for peace. The Emperor did not put in the Guard, his final reserve, which might have made the victory decisive, and caused Alexander to open negotiations. For this, Napoleon has been much criticized by military writers; but he was 2,000 miles from home, and the Old Guard was his last resource. Whether he was right or wrong will always be a subject of discussion. At the decisive moment, about the middle of the afternoon, if he had sent in this superb body of picked troops, still 20,000 strong, with which he had so many times struck a decisive blow at the critical moment, he might have made Borodino a crushing Russian defeat. On the other hand, had he put in his last reserves without success, as later at Waterloo, his army would have been a flying mob in half an hour. At Borodino his motto was "Safety first." At Waterloo he was playing all for all. After the battle, the Russians retreated slowly to Moscow, followed by the French. The victors were too much exhausted to pursue with the vigor of former campaigns. In front of Moscow, Kutuzov called a council of war to decide whether the city should be defended, and the vote was in favor of fighting to the death. But Kutuzov thought that the army was more important to Russia than the city, and refused to be bound by the council. On the 14th of September he marched through the city and retired to Panki. At the same time most of the population departed. Murat and his cavalry arrived at 2 o'clock the same afternoon and took possession of the city. The Guard, when it arrived, was sent in to occupy the Kremlin. Ney and Davout took up a position west of the city, Poniatowski on the south, and Eugene to the north. Murat was stationed on the road to the southeast. The imperial headquarters were established temporarily in the west suburb. Moscow, like Rome, lies upon 7 hills. It was the sacred city of Russia, and its 200 churches with colored domes and belfries gave it a most picturesque appearance, more Oriental than European in its aspect. During the first night fires began to break out, and by the morning of the second day the whole city was aflame. The Emperor, who had taken up his quarters in the Kremlin, was forced to retire to a castle outside the walls of the city. On the 18th, after some 8,000 houses had been consumed, the fire was controlled, and Napoleon returned to the Kremlin. It will always be a disputed question whether Moscow was deliberately set afire by the Russians, or whether the conflagration was due to accidental causes, but the latter was probably the case. In a city built entirely of wood, in possession of a marauding army, fires might easily be started by carelessness, and the equinoctial gales did the rest. It was at this time that Napoleon made the most fatal error of his life. After the fire he should have begun his retreat at once, but he tarried at Moscow for a whole month, hoping against hope that the Czar would sue for peace. Since St. Jean d'Acre he had never retired from an operation. After Eylau and at Essling he had not hesitated to reculer pour mieux sauter. But he had never yet faced failure, and he could not bring himself to believe in it now. Moreover, retreat was no easy matter. Whichever way he turned, his path was beset with almost insurmountable difficulties. 4 plans were considered by the Emperor. First, to winter in Moscow. Second, to march on St. Petersburg. Third, to retire on the southern provinces. Fourth, to retreat to Smolensk via Kaluga, following a route far to the south of his line of advance. The first he rejected at once as not feasible. The second was truly Napoleonic in its audacity, and strongly appealed to the great soldier, but the difficulties far exceeded the chances. The third plan was open to the same objections as the first. Only the fourth remained, and this was finally adopted. On the 15th of October the Emperor issued his orders for the retreat, and 4 days later he left Moscow. When the retreat began, Napoleon had in and around Moscow 5 corps, the Guard, and the cavalry reserve, in all 100,000 men. At different points in the rear there were 6 more corps and the Austrian contingent, about 140,000 troops, or a grand total of 250,000. On the Russian side there was the main army, considerably reinforced, under Kutuzov, 140,000, and 4 detachments amounting in all to 150,000, making a total of 290,000. Although the relative strength of the adversaries was not yet unfavorable to Napoleon, it was certain to become so as time went by. Above all, the serious lack of horses for the cavalry and artillery could not easily be made up. In order to give his retreat the appearance of an offensive movement, and to direct it through parts of the country which had not already been devastated, the Emperor proposed to retire by the old highway towards Kalouga, and from there by a southerly route to Smolensk. On the 24th of October, Napoleon found Kutuzov at Mao-Yaroslavlitz, posted across the road from Moscow to Kalouga, and an action was fought there between the leading columns of the 2 armies. Each general kept his main body back, as neither wanted to be drawn into a decisive engagement at this point. The next day the Russians retreated to Kalouga, and Napoleon turned back to the northwest towards Borodino. There was a new road to Smolensk via Yuknov and Yelna, of which Napoleon had desired to take advantage, and why he did not do so after Kutuzov withdrew will ever remain an unsolved mystery. This has been called by some historians the turning point of his career, but it was not so much so as his decision at Smolensk to advance to Moscow. The maneuver towards Kalouga was strategically sound, for the new road he proposed to take led through an undevastated region to Smolensk, and only as a last resort, after a defeat, was it excusable to follow the old route. On learning of this movement of the French, Kutuzov struck off to the northwest in pursuit. The failure of the Russian campaign has generally been ascribed to the weather, but this is only partially true. For nearly 3 weeks after the army left Moscow the weather was perfect. The winter season was delayed, and there was less cold and snow than usual. The temperature averaged from 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Few of the streams were frozen, and it was the 7th of November before real cold set in. After this date there was great suffering in the bivouacs, and the snow destroyed all the forage for the animals. This rapidly decreased the French forces, and Napoleon entered Smolensk with his army reduced to 75,000 men and about 100 horses. Here Napoleon received intelligence that Saint-Cyr and Victor had been defeated and driven back towards Vitebsk, and later that that place had been occupied by the Russians. Under the circumstances he had no alternative except to try to reach Vilna by way of Borisov. The retreat from Smolensk began the 12th of November. The vigorous efforts of the Russians to impede the retreat led to several small actions around Krasny 5 days later. But Napoleon halted with the Guard, and personally directed a counter-attack upon Kutuzov, who drew off his troops and ceased to pursue the French. At this time Napoleon received the discouraging news that the Russians had seized Borisov, and the crossing of the Beresina River, and stood with 40,000 men upon his main line of retreat. At this moment Napoleon was 80 miles away. Yet, in spite of the fact that he had 1 army in front of him, and 2 others threatening his flank and rear, each stronger than his own, Napoleon was successful in forcing the passage of the river. By this achievement, in a situation which almost any other general would have led to the surrender of his entire army, the Emperor won fresh laurels. After making a demonstration at one point, as if he intended to cross there, and drawing off the Russians to the south, Napoleon threw 2 bridges across at a place farther west by which the main body crossed. The river was about 100 yards broad, and the ice floes increased the difficulty. The bridges were then destroyed. At this stage the French army consisted of about 30,000 troops and nearly twice as many camp followers. Napoleon did not retreat through Minsk, as he originally intended, but directed his army on Vilna. Before reaching there he turned the command over to Murat, and hastened to Paris. Vilna also had to be abandoned, and Murat recrossed the Niemen on the 15th of December with a miserable body of 5,000 combatants and 45,000 others, while Davout and Poniatowski led the remnants of the other three corps across at another point. Only Cossacks continued the pursuit west of the Beresina. The Russian army, also reduced to about 60,000 men, entered Vilna the middle of December. Napoleon had led 450,000 men across the Niemen in June, and had received reinforcements of 150,000. Of these, only about 150,000 returned. Thus the French lost about 450,000 men, probably one-third sick or prisoners, the balance killed and missing. The Russian losses were about 250,000, or proportionately even greater than the French. On leaving the army, the Emperor took Caulaincourt with him in the carriage, and Roustan on the box. Duroc and Mouton followed. After consulting with Maret at Vilna, he drove to Warsaw, and thence to Dresden and Paris, traveling day and night as was his lifelong habit. He reached the Tuileries on the 18th of December. The criticism of Napoleon for abandoning his army is absolutely unwarranted. The fate of the Grand Army was sealed, and nothing he could do now would change it. Any one of his generals could lead the remnants back to the Niemen as well as he. The place of the Emperor as head of the State was now at Paris. The statement in his last bulletin that "the health of His Majesty has never been better," has also been pointed out as selfish. But has not the health of a sovereign always been considered, even in times of peace, as a matter of prime importance to the State? How much more, then, the health of the Emperor at the end of a great campaign, when reports of his death had been circulated at Paris? It is remarkable that not one of the French commanders above the rank of general of division lost his life; also, that the proportion of officers who returned was much above that of the men. If this had not been the case, Napoleon would have been unable to raise an efficient army in 1813. They one and all had fearlessly exposed themselves during the campaign, and the fact can only be explained by their higher morale. Some of the principal reasons for the failure of the Russian campaign have been stated above, and there is not space to go into the matter further. The principal error was in not realizing the fact that in Russia, as in Spain, large armies will starve, and small ones will get beaten. This much can be said: there was no other living commander who could have got any part of the Grand Army from Moscow back to the Niemen. Chapter 19.